Liam O'Meara to the stage.
So we lost one speaker, but I was crazy enough to come in tonight, despite having blown out my knee at convention and having a little migraine. But this is excellent practice for being immortal on the campaign trail. All right. So now, the American dream is not dead, but it is dying, and it is being killed by a faulty bipartisan economic consensus adopted in the 1970s and 80s. I am, as said, Dr. Liam O'Meara, and I am running for Congress to restore the promise of those bold liberal visions that built the middle class in the first place. For 40 years, living standards have been falling in this great country, but that period followed a prior 40-year stretch of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity. It is time to admit that we made a wrong turn, we're on the wrong path, and to outline a new direction, right, which follows the data, and that's where I think a historian can be useful here. I was not born into an upper middle class life. In fact, I am still, like so many of my generation, relatively poor and in debt, struggling to make income match expenses. My origin story is solidly working class. My mother ran a child care center out of her house, and my father worked on the waterfront in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. I followed my father onto the waterfront, but by the time I was able to step into those boots, the field was already in sharp decline, due both to automation and to the collapse of unions in the Reagan era. So I had to split time between shifts in the waterfront and shifts as a fry cook in order to make ends meet. Sometime in those years, on my own, I picked up some skill with computers and moved into IT for a little while. But even in the last stages of that career path, when I was working in a small office in a little aerospace company in Long Beach, I still kept on my boots and my union cap. You know, because they helped me remember who I am. And from there, though, I did manage to get into college. No one in my family had ever gone before, so I was the first in my family to finish a university degree, and then I insanely went straight on from there to finish my BA, my MA, and my PhD. But at the end of all that, I fell into my dream job, teaching subjects that I love to bright young minds in colleges, and trying to inspire in them some of the passion that I bring to my work and my studies every day. And I'm still wearing my steel-toe boots and union cap. I think being conscious of my origins has helped me to relate to the aspirations of my students, growing up as they are in an era of decline. My generation was the first in American history not to exceed its predecessors' economic expectations, and the ones after me have sharply lower expectations. The progressive model that had underscored such impressive gains in the 50s and 60s, when the U.S. experienced its longest sustained economic boom, was rejected in the 70s and 80s in favor of a corporate-centered, trickle-down neoliberal model. It was a classic case of tossing the baby with the bathwater, when what it had needed was some refinement. This put us into a long-term cycle of decline, which was predicted quite accurately in the 1970s to lead to a low-wage, low-growth economy. Since the Reagan Revolution and the entrenchment of this neoliberalism, every U.S. administration has followed the same basic template. The result, rising childhood poverty and infant mortality, falling lifespans and failing health. The United States currently ranks as the 35th healthiest country in the world, and the World Health Organization considers us to have a healthcare system weaker than the entire developed world. Now, whereas the war on poverty in the 1960s and 70s saw the national rate decline by 10%, under Reaganomics, it has since shot back up, fully reversing those trends. And in absolute terms, the number of people in poverty in the United States today is the highest ever recorded. Despite being the richest country in the history of the world, the United States currently has living standards ranked 16th in the world and still falling. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Our education system is getting weaker and falling farther behind the rest of the world. Consumer debt has hit crisis levels, and home ownership is out of reach for increasing numbers of people, whether due to student loan debts or to the deliberately built-in insecurity in the workforce. Now, that neoliberal insistence on a flexible workforce actually saw full-time employment with benefits and pensions virtually collapse in favor of people working multiple part-time jobs just to make a living. And union membership in this country has sunk to lows not seen since before the Great Depression. Wages for American workers have, adjusting for inflation, remained stagnant since the 1970s, and in some cases have literally fallen. And this despite massively increased productivity. We are working harder and being paid less. And on top of that, automation continues to threaten American jobs, with fully 37% of American jobs at risk of disappearing in the coming decades. One of the problems that I constantly run into in thinking through this thing is that we look at people talking in the news about the economy. Oh, the economy's doing all right. And we tend to think that's just the GDP or the stock market or something. Those are not actually the economy. The actual economy in the United States, in real terms, has been falling farther and farther behind. In so many ways, as a consequence, we live in dangerous times. And sleepwalking into these changes is what got us into the Trump era in the first place. It, to me, is a bit akin to the frog in the water pot. You know, the temperature is rising slowly and steadily. And if we're not paying attention to what's happening, we could boil before we even recognize the danger that we're in. It is time, from my perspective, then, to articulate bold visions for the future, something in which Democrats used to excel. And then to outline these and express them to voters in ways that make sense. Well, one of the things that I think actually fits this district too, for thinking about the basic composition. You guys know this is a hard district for Democrats to win. Yeah, we're all aware of this, right? But this did not used to be the case. Democrats used to dominate the heartland of this country when we used to speak directly to working class issues and to rural issues. The more we walked away from speaking directly to those concerns, the more it opened the door to dishonest rhetoric from the right to snap them up. And since the rise of the Reagan Democrats back in the 80s, we have steadily lost ground among the working class. And that has to change. And this is a place that we can work on that. So, one place that I think that this could change is our messaging, the way we express ideas to the voters. Now, Republicans frequently put Democrats on the defensive in messaging here, with a lot of very good pithy slogans that sort of put them on the defensive by kind of setting up the terms that intentionally favor them. Or they start rattling off a stream of obvious falsehoods, and while Democrats are trying to correct them on factual basis, they're running off to do the next thing, right? And when you go to the voters on those kind of issues and directly predict them on that, well, that's not true, then you're running into a psychological barrier, right? So it's very difficult. It leaves very little time for us to get our messages across, right? So in campaigning in an area like this, there are a handful of basic principles that I would follow in trying to reach out and meet as many people as I can, go as many places as I can, every place I possibly can to reach out to independents and conservatives to bring that message across. So, first principle, talk to everyone, even those who hate you. 2, I will tend to downplay divisive wedge issues wherever possible and focus on the areas of overlap, right, the areas of common interest. 3, I will, wherever possible, favor questions that provoke discussions rather than attacks that provoke defensiveness. And 4, I think we need to be prepared to discuss progressive policies in ways that people wouldn't expect, right? Use uncommon messaging, uncommon approaches, right? Now, one thing that will stand out about my campaign as a whole, and this, I guess, comes from me being sort of an egghead academic, right, is a sort of policy-centric nature of it. There's already quite a few listed on the early version of my website that's up. I actually have a friend that's currently redrafting the website for me, and I have a handful of other policies that I'm going to be adding to that once I'm comfortable enough with the language on them. But there's always going to be quite a few specific issues that I'm running on, and specific ones that will come up a lot in my messaging. I'd like to give just a handful of examples, just a couple of quick examples here of some of the policies that I would want to run on in the campaign, and specifically focusing on ways that I could message them to the independents and the conservatives that we need to sway in order to win these inland districts. So, let's start with what I think is going to be a really big one and sort of decisive in the 2020 election, healthcare. I'm sure we're all aware that the American healthcare system is not what it could be. Right? That it leaves millions uninsured and millions more underinsured. That it forces people into emergency rooms and into bankruptcy for preventable illnesses. Right? We waste vast sums of money spending about twice as much as any comparable rich country, and we get worse results for it. So the big question that comes up a lot is, why do we do this? Why do the voters consistently choose to be poorer and less healthy? From my perspective, the problem is the messaging. The Republican Party and its backers will produce slick propaganda that lies to voters about the way the insurance system works and the way healthcare works, and builds a sense of fear around that. And Democratic messaging tends to focus on the patent immorality of the current system, right? And the need to take care of people, right? Counting on people's natural empathy to rise up and say, well, we should clearly fix this problem. If that was going to work, we would have had universal health care when it started being proposed in the 1960s, right? So I've worked out in my discussions over the years with independent and conservative voters responses to 9 common objections to universal health care. I'm going to give you just a couple of those, right, as an example here, focusing only on the cost and on freedom, a perceived loss with universal health care for some people. Because it's often argued from the right that you don't want bureaucrats in charge of your health care, right? But what's just as often completely missed in that is that bureaucrats are already involved in your health care and already making those decisions. But in a profit-based system, they have a greater incentive to deny care. Does anyone remember in the 2008 election the discussion of death panels around the ACA and all that? Those death panels already exist, and they're working in corporate America to deny coverage for things, right? It's something that happens nowhere else in the world. A Medicare system is not only more accountable to voters than a market-based system is to consumers, but the absence of the profit motive actually increases the freedom for you, the consumers, and for your physicians to choose the treatment that's right for you, right? People tend to mix it up with the idea of a complete state-run system when all it's replacing is the insurance middleman in between. And that gets to the cost, because the cost issue should be a lot more easy to message than it is. The problem here is, again, we need to hit this over and over and over again and drive into people the core point that Medicare is cheaper. Because they keep hitting us on, this will raise your taxes, we're already in debt, we can't afford the debt, the deficit, which has nothing to do with anything. We're already paying twice as much as we would need to afford Medicare for all. Right? So I'm going to use myself as an example. Looking at the current policy proposals for Medicare for all, my tax bill would go up by $1,200. But I would lose all of my co-pays and all of my monthly insurance premiums, saving me, with my health, $8,000 to $10,000 a year looking at my expenses, because I have to pay out of pocket for my insurance. But not everyone does. So someone might come back to me and say, well, I get insurance from my employer, so this is just raising my taxes and that just cost me more money. So you come back to them and say, well, wait a minute. That insurance is part of your compensation package, which means as soon as they don't have to pay for that insurance, you get a raise. Really? Yeah. How's that's not that far already? Okay, cool. Really? Okay, so we'll wind down the healthier issue anyway, and I'll move into conclusions. So, Lisa's one here off and that one there. All right, so, now. Oh, 2 pages worth of junk we have to miss here. Okay, so, now, I don't want free stuff, and I don't think most of you want free stuff anyway, right? That's not really the point of talking about social policies, right, and helping people out anyway. The U.S. used to lead the world in social mobility, but now pales beside Western Europe in social mobility. And this is, to me, unacceptable. So in response, I'm pitching sensible investments in society that would allow the benefits of being in the richest country in the world to accrue not just at the top, but to ordinary people. To create greater, I'm arguing not for equality of outcome, but for greater equality of opportunity. Now, you have to know history to change history. I've spent many years studying these issues. I have well-defined policy positions on dozens of areas, and I think that my experience as an educator in the classroom gives me a way to message them to different people along the way. So, with your help and support, knowing that this is a hard road in this district, I think we can get this message out to a broader audience, engage directly with voters, and try to convince them that we can all be better off, that we can all be richer than we are. All right? So, I'm Liam O'Mara, and I'm going to represent you in the 42nd.
So do we have some questions for Liam? Jerry's got a question.
We had Steve Ruth speak to our group 4 or 5 months ago, something like that, and he said exactly that. Republicans have a better messaging ability than we do. When you look at pro-life, how do you take the other side of pro-life? That's a tough one. When Hillary ran for president and gave a talk, she told the coal miners, "You guys are toast." She spoke the truth, and that is the future, but that did not help her in the slightest. So you're talking about messaging. How in the latest thing I saw, and I mentioned the coal thing because of this, the latest thing that the current administration is coming up with is we're going to have clean fossil fuels.
That was like clean coal. What about clean coal? Remember
What
that
are your
one?
responses, suggestions?
Barack, come on.
Okay, so on the specific issue of like, coal and what you do with coal miners. All right, so,
For gas and.
yeah, for any of these things, right? Is there a big industry today in like horse and buggy repair? Right? Is the industry's always changed,
Norco.
right? The technology's always changed, right? What we need to do is provide people the skills to adapt to a new economy, right? So the focus there is on education, and not just for, I know tuition-free college has been coming up a lot for the public institutions. I would also argue for tuition-free trade schools, because not everyone needs to go to college, not everyone wants to go to college, right? If you're giving people the skills to do things, and this is where you can point to data on this, right? Think about, I can give you a simple example. The Germans have an economy about 1/7 the size of the United States economy, right? And yet they export more than we do. Right? Because when foreign competition shows up in a particular field, they retrain people for a new field and put them back to work, keeping consistently low unemployment and keeping a competitive edge, in a globalized economy. We could do very much the same thing.
I agree with that. Why can't we get people to that? Why can't we get them to understand that solar is a whole new industry that can employ all the people that would be put out in the old things that we have? We went from the agrarian society 100 years ago into our industrial society, and yet we still have tens of millions of Americans thinking that we're going to be producing steel again and going back. Do we want those good old days that much? Why can't we look at the future? Why can't we see the future for what
And
it
often
is?
people thinking that we can close off the U.S. economy completely and just make everything we need for ourselves, ignoring the fact that the cost would go up, which means our prosperity would decline, living standards would go down considerably. If the economy was closed off to the rest of the world, this is one of the reasons that the tariffs are so problematic. Now, one of the things I think that comes up there specifically, and this gets a little technical for this kind of discussion here, is a lot of it's psychological. There are a lot of tricks that Republican messaging uses that sets people up in the first place, and then we tend not to recognize what those are and run straight into them, which means we're falling into traps, right? We're basically trying to respond and shoot down to something that often frays people's patience. You end up saying, well, that's just stupid. How can you not understand this? And they lose their patience. Well, as soon as you question someone's intelligence, you've lost them. The thing is, and this is a point that I try to make oftentimes in classes, liberals and conservatives are no more intelligent than each other, right? And one side isn't definitively right in the way that it basically thinks, because the basic brain structures on both sides co-evolved for a reason, right? They serve different basic functions, but they think differently, right? There's always wiggle room within that. People shift a bit over the course of their lives, but people are born with certain basic ways that they perceive the world, right? And if you try to get someone to see the way that you see the world using your language exactly, you have lost them immediately. And we tend to try to address the questions in a way that appeals to us. And we explain in a way that would make sense. If someone told me this, I would like that. That would make sense to me. And that tends to fail. So from my perspective, it's a matter of recognizing what actually does work in terms of reaching people. Is that open over there?
Anybody else? One more question if somebody's got one? So let's see. Rock, paper, scissors between the two of you guys? Let's see, we get to hear from you a lot. Is that okay? Can we hear from you?
I don't really have a question so much as a comment in what you were saying. With Trump talking about tariffs all the time, instead of saying they're tariffs, their taxes on us. They're increasing our taxes,
Exactly.
which is something that conservatives are always saying we shouldn't be doing. So instead of saying tariffs, we say they're increased taxes.
It's a good point, and I'll double down on that one in a second here, because we often accede to their positioning. You mentioned that when you mentioned the pro-life one, which is a fantastic argument. Another one, though, is simply looking at the tax cuts, right? Trump passed a tax cut last year, right? Before that, W. Bush passed a tax cut. Before that, Reagan passed a tax cut. And every time we accept that this is actually a tax cut because a small bit of it actually comes down to us at our level, and our tax bill technically goes down a little bit. But you know what pays for that? Deficit spending and debt. So it's a bit more akin to taking a cash advance on your credit card. Did you get any extra money? No, you got debt, right? So if we refuse to accept the term tax cut and instead say, no, you passed a tax rise. The one under Trump was particularly egregious because all of the ones that affect the middle and working class have sunset provisions and expire. All the ones for the rich do not, right? So we have basically handed them a tax cut, raised taxes on 85% of Americans. Right. So you see how we can turn that back around? You can often turn the small government language, the tax cut language, right back around on them, right? If you kind of go around where they are, right, and try to hit them on their issue.
Two things real quick. Number one, if you're going to argue the pro-choice thing, it's not pro-choice, pro-life. The argument from now on, and remember this, it's pro-choice versus no choice. They need the big bucks. I need your website address. I think you will do it, and I'll put it up on the website.
Yeah, it's a good one, right? My personal approach on that one is I tend to evade the language entirely and skip them and focus on bodily autonomy, right? Because if you make an argument for basic bodily autonomy, right now under current United States law, we often accord more bodily autonomy to a male corpse than to a living, breathing female. Right? If you focus on individual rights and bodily autonomy, you can basically subvert the whole argument and say, well, you're just basically handing the government more control over you, more power over you. So, we're through the 5 minutes.
So I'm just saying 5 minutes is up.
Yep.
Appreciate you coming in and having a talk with us.
It's liamomera.org. liamomera.org, yeah. The way it looks is going to change in a couple of weeks, but it's got tons of material already up there, right? Ways to like sign up and mail list and all that.
So for those of you.
Yeah.